Record. Okay, so we're now recording. Okay, so my name's Ruth Duerr, and I'm presenting on a set of bylaws that a bunch of us have been working on for the last 8 months or so. And you can see the people's names who have spent really weeks working on this with me. We've been meeting for quite long time, and these are the regulars who always show up. And but I should note that over the 8 months, there have been a variety of other people who have joined us occasionally just to check in and make comments and things like that. So it's really been oh, how interesting. It's been a very interesting process. So what I'm going to talk about today is whatever happened to the old Ronin Institute, just very briefly. Just remind everybody what the bylaws are and why they're important. And then talk about our team, its history, its goals, and the processes we've been using. And then talk about, the content of the new bylaws, which are considerably different than the bylaws that were in action with the original Ronin Institute. And I'll end up with talking about some of the next steps that need to happen in order to uh, put the uh, to put to get the Ronin Institute back on track. And I'm sorry, that that ding you may have heard is other people joining us, so I had to take a second out and let them in. Anyway, so um, I'm gonna ask you all to hold questions till the end, and Keith, please moderate it. Thank you. Okay, so the thing you really need to understand is that the old Ronin Institute is either dead or dying. And by that, I mean that if you look at the California Secretaries of State's database of all the basically corporations in the country, its status is forfeited and FTB. And what that FTB means is that they can't do business. They can't do any kind of contracts. They can't even defend themselves in court. They can't buy or sell real property. They can't file for refunds or tax extensions or anything like that. In fact, they're not even legally allowed to close or dissolve the company itself, and they lose their tax exempt status. So basically, the quote existing Ronin Institute is kind of null and void at this point. Um, and more than that, we don't have an official replacement for it established. In other words, right at this point in time, there is no Ronin Institute of any kind or shape anywhere, not officially anyway. And so what does that mean? It means that there is no possibility of having things like an official board or council. There are no processes for creating them even. And that the whole concept of voting of members is also a non-starter because there can't be members of an organization that doesn't exist. So the whole point of our group is to get to the point where those statements are no longer true. And just to remind everybody where we came from, on January 20th of 2024, we got a new board of directors. That was about a year after John, our old president, quit and left the existing board of directors. And then just a couple months later, we got a data breach nonsense letter from the board. And a week later, they basically said they're going to resign and close the board, close the organization. And so currently, the Institute is in a delinquent tax status, and we tried very hard to get a hold of the last few board members and totally failed. So, on to what are the bylaws? They're the rules that govern how a company is run. Um, and that includes things like what standards it should follow, what operations it does, who's responsible, how do they what kind of procedures do they have for following, for meetings or when you have an issue that needs action. And, you know, the last and most important things is some way to actually modify the bylaws because I think everybody recognizes the world changes over time. And so this is a legal document that tells organizations, governments, what your organization is all about. So, how the bylaws team got set up was about a month or so after we got the notice of closure. I and there was a lot of chaos back then, and several communication channels got set up. But what I didn't hear was anybody volunteering to try and fix the problems with the current bylaws that caused the situation that we were in. And so I put a little challenge out to the community that basically said, I'm willing to work on bylaws if I can find some other people to help me. And I wasn't really expecting anybody to volunteer, but fortunately, the four people you saw up in front and a few others did indeed volunteer. And so, on June 7th, we met for the first time and started working on creating bylaws. And and the very first things we did were try and get hold of the existing board, basically Dana, trying to figure out what was really going on. And I have to say that was totally unsuccessful. But in the meantime, we started working on what we thought the bylaws really should say. And after a month or a couple of meetings, we actually ended up having a small group of regulars who always showed up. And what that group did was that many of us have belonged to other groups and communities and had bylaws that we could look at. And some of those are the American Geophysical Union bylaws, the Federation of Earth Science Information Partners bylaws, um, the Research Data Alliance bylaws, the local contexts. The last two are large international organizations that Lori Hawk um, had some responsibility for making sure they were functional. She's the person who actually started the ORC ID. Um, Most investigators now have ORCIDs because you need an ORCID to actually publish a paper these days in most journals. Um, so we actually went out and looked at all of these places and tried to do as best as we could and in figuring out, well, what made these things work, what's a bad thing, etc. Um, we've been holding hour-and-a-half meetings since June, basically. We started off meeting every other week, but that wasn't getting us anywhere fast enough. So since about September of this last year, we've been meeting weekly. So there's actually hundreds of hours of time spent on these bylaws. And not everything is done in meeting. We have had many action items that people have gone off and done. We had a first draft of the bylaws way back in September, and we sent them off to both a lawyer and to Lori Hawk back then and got responses back fairly quickly. The lawyer's response was basically that we had very little that was wrong with it, that it would be pretty much legally okay to go ahead. But I also note that Lori had considerably more concerns, and her concerns were based mostly because um, she's mostly been dealing with international organizations, and she wanted to make the Ronin Institute or ensure that we understood that in order to make this more international, we had to do some additional work. And so we spent um, several months now getting a draft that was responsive to all of that. And so we intend to send that second complete draft out to the same set of people um, here very shortly, as soon as we're pretty sure that we have a solid draft. Um, Now, our purpose as a team is to keep as much of the good from the original Ronin Institute as possible, in particular, the mission to reinvent academia, which is badly needs reinventing at this point, and to keep a lot of the values and principles of truth and empathy, to not discriminate against anybody based on anything, and to try and make it a very welcoming place for basically everybody who needs that sort of home. One of the other concepts of the Ronin Institute we're trying to keep alive is the whole concept of duocracy, except we're trying to do better about that because it never really, it wasn't really a principle that had teeth in it in the old Ronin Institute, such that that's probably why one of the reasons why John resigned is because he actually got overloaded because he didn't really know how to say no and point fingers at people and say you need to do that. um, and in general, when you're writing bylaws for an organization, you need them to be as minimal as possible so that you don't overly constrain the organization and have it end up in lots of lawsuits. But you also want to maximize the protections for its members and people, and that is one of the main goals that we've been trying to achieve, which is to do that balancing act. Um, the old Ronin Institute had problems because there were no such things as members. None of the people on this call really, had any say in the running of the old Ronin Institute at all, and we wanted to change that. So our team process has been that we pretty much work by consensus decision making, which is, I think, the right way to go. It's not Robert's Rules of Orders. It's basically called when you get to a point where everybody's not totally objecting to um, whatever you're trying to decide, and they accept the language. They may not think it's perfect, but it's good enough and it's fine. Then then you call that a consensus because everybody agrees that this is good enough. Um, and we do try very hard not to revisit decisions that have already been made unless you really have a strong reason that the whole team agrees with. In other words, that consensus thing again. Um, as by strong reason, I usually mean something on the order of, oh, it's a legal problem if we don't. Um, so, so talking about what's in the new bylaws, um, well, we have mostly kept the same name, but we've added the word 2.0 to the end of it to get across the idea that this is the second experiment in doing the Ronin Institute. Um, and we have an acronym now, and it's RIIS, RIIS, as in rising up like a phoenix. Um, in other words, we're basically rebirthing the institution from scratch. We're planning on incorporating in the state of California, which is a state where there are many members. There are not that many states where there are many members, so you want to we don't want to have any single points of failures, which is one of the other problems the Ronin Institute had, the original Ronin Institute had. Um, and it's being organized exclusively for charitable, scholarly, and scientific and educational purposes, such that at some point it can become a nonprofit again, unless certain presidents decide that there are no such things as nonprofits. And we have two kinds of membership, if you want to call it that. You can either be a fellow or an associate, and I'll talk about each of those here in a second. Um, so if you want to become a fellow, we have some eligibility criteria. I will note that the original Ronin scholars are grandfathered in if they choose to be so. They don't have to. Um, for new people, excuse me, I have to get a drink. For new people, we're saying that there's a requirement for some level of academic achievement and scholarly commitment, which is equivalent to at least 1 year of study at a accredited university. But that's equivalent. Um, for example, we did not want to discriminate against citizen scientists, experts in fields that aren't a traditional study area. For example, sea ice expertise are the people that I have a lot of experience with, and they know a lot more than the research community in academia does about how sea ice behaves, for example. Um, uh, Members must agree, both old and new, to the code of conduct and ethics, and we need to pay annual dues. And dues in this context means some combination of both money and hours of volunteer work. In other words, the duocracy means that people have to do work because if they don't, nothing gets done. And there needs to be some level of money because there are costs to having an organization, especially an organization with some level of infrastructure. For example, in California, first year registrations cost something like 135 or something or other dollars. To get a trademark is like $350. Um, and uh, I note from having read the original Ronin documents that it looked like the original Ronin um, board members had chipped in a grand total of $12,000 to get the organization started. Clearly, we probably aren't going to start off with that much. Anyways, now, just because it consists of money and hours of work, um, we spent a long time talking about how we make it equitable for folks across the world, um, where, the standards of living and things like that vary dramatically. And so we didn't come up with a good way of making that sort of means based, but the intent is there such that, if you come from a place where the average daily wage is 12 bucks, we aren't going to ask, $100 from you, for example. I mean, that's very unfair. We see that in scholarly publication all the time where people are asked to pay unreasonable amounts if they, well, actually, practically everybody is asked to pay unreasonable amounts in that particular case, but in some cases it's worse than others. And for becoming a fellow, you have certain rights, and that is you get to participate in all of the RIIS programs. You get to vote for who is on the council. We decided that we did not want to have a board. We wanted to have a council. Um, and on any other kind of vote, like even the vote to dissolve the organization would be opened up to all of the fellows. Um, and if we ever get to the point where we have sufficient uh, work hours uh, or can hire people to official professional people to do things like manage the funding and that sort of thing. If we get to that point, then you would be able to request RISE to administer your awards, grants, or contracts. You also can attend the annual virtual fellows meeting. All the meetings will be, we're just assuming all the meetings will be virtual unless somebody's calling something local in their own area. And you can also petition for special business meetings if there's something in particular that you think absolutely needs to be done and you're not a council member. If you can convince 10% of the rest of the fellows to sign on, then you can have a special meeting about that. The other category of sort of membership is for associates who really can't commit either time or money to being a member. But they do have the same requirements for admission as a fellow does, and they're bound by the same rules of conduct as fellows are. The big difference is they can't vote. They can't vote in council meetings. They can't participate in council meetings. They can't vote in fellows meetings, but they can actually join working groups and participate in those. They can attend seminars like this one, and they can use the online forums. So, so now let's talk about the council or the replacement for what, the original Ronin had as a board. And that is a governing body elected by the fellows. This is entirely different than the original one. It'll have somewhere between 6 and 15 members. It appoints officers of the organization from amongst its members. The terms would be 3 years, and which basically means we're trying to have a third of the council replaced every election every year. And there aren't term limits, but we don't allow self-nominations. If you can't find at least one other person to nominate you, we're not convinced you should run. Hold on just a second. I'm sorry, I think I'm getting a cold. Okay, so there will be at least 4 officers on the council selected by the council. They consist of a chair, secretary, a treasurer, and a past chair. The officers are elected annually. They can be re-elected, except that we thought that the chair should switch out at least every 3 years. We also note that any given counselor can only hold one office at a time, and that each of the officers should be mentoring at least one, preferably 2 or more, other counselor in their duties. In other words, we really don't want to have any single points of failure. So, and the goal is to never have only one counselor who has knowledge or access to perform one of the officers' sets of duties. So, as the corollary to that, anytime you have a new counselor joining the board, they must uh, apprentice with one of the officers. So the officer's duties are pretty much what you would expect. The chair basically convenes and presides at the council meetings, presides at the fellows meeting, um, and is the chief executive of the corporation if we can't afford to hire professional staff, which we certainly won't be able to do at the beginning. The treasurer will be the bookkeeper if we can't hire professional staff. Obviously, getting enough members so that one could do that would be a much better thing, but we can't start that way. And the secretary is basically in charge of the corporate records and membership database. Um, I do note that in addition to the council, we expect to have several standing working groups, and they would be things like finance, infrastructure, membership, and communications. The point there is that we don't expect, for example, the treasurer to do all the work themselves, but to have a committee with which they work, um, so that we have more than one eye on the books at all time. And I also note that, each of these standing working groups should report back to the council at every council meeting, and that we expect that one or more counselor will be a member of those standing working groups, or even running them, um, uh, at all times, so that there's good, close um, coordination and communication between the groups. I also note that the bylaws say that the council may create ad hoc working groups as needed, and I expect that that'll happen a lot, particularly at the beginning, because there are a lot of things that need to be decided and stood up that the bylaws group has not taken on. Um, I think I've already said this, except for the last part here, is that um, each of these working groups has a remit provided to it by the council. And as long as they're staying in that remit, they don't have to go back to the council. They can do what they need to do to get the job done. But if things come up that are outside of that remit, um, they have to bring it to the council. The whole idea is that the council makes the decisions and therefore needs to have, the legal protection of insurance, but that all of the volunteers, which the council are also volunteers, but all of the member volunteers um, have no legal liability, which is a rule in the United States that I think needs to be strictly adhered to. Um, there are also in the new bylaws the procedures for amending them. And there's two ways that they can be amended. One is the council can decide that they need to amend them, and if the two-thirds of the council agrees, then those amendments can be proposed and accepted. That doesn't mean they're actually ratified at that point, but they're accepted. Um, but if 15% of the fellows think that something needs to change, they can also petition for that. And at that point, which either way things have come up, those amendments are reviewed by the council, which then makes a recommendation to the larger fellows group, in other words, everybody, um, in regards to how these uh, changed amendments, are consistent or not with the existing bylaws. What are issues legally speaking? In other words, do they go against applicable law in whatever state or the United States as a whole? And whether they're actually contrary to the mission and values of RIIS. And at that point, they go out for a member vote, and two-thirds majority is required to ratify them. So there's a lot of detail in the bylaws, and I encourage you to go read them. I have a page towards the end that has all the links and a QR code. But here's what needs to happen next, and that is that I talked about how we're going to have the lawyer and Lori review the updated version of the bylaws to make sure that they're consistent with the changes that have been requested and still look legally fine. In other words, you always have to have your bylaws vetted by lawyers. We're planning on incorporating in the state of California, but to do that, you need a list of officers. And so we decided that the bylaws group may as well be that list of officers for the moment. And we started soliciting other people to help out. And the people who agreed to do that were Alex, which we're really grateful for because he was the one who is really responsible for maintaining the infrastructure of the old Ronin Institute and can certainly help get the new version of that set up and running. And Jorrit, because he is really he's actually gotten us a GitHub site that is active and backed up and keeping all of our records, etc., going. So he's he's been doing that, and so it's important to keep that up. So the purpose of that interim set of quote officers, if you want to call it that, is just to get the whole institute up and running, make it an official organization. Once you have an official organization, then you could actually register an initial set of fellows and collect those dues. and hold the initial elections for council. And one would hope that that whole process could be done as fast as possible because it would be nice to get it going sooner rather than later. Um, in addition, for incorporating in the state of California, we need to create a bank account because there are funds that need to be paid in order to even do the incorporation. And we've picked the California Firefighters Credit Union for that because they're all over California. And two, they're well known for supporting nonprofits. For example, the minute we have a new council, the officers who have access to that bank account, which right at the moment um, would include me and Jovita, can hand that off to the treasurer and their apprentices, I guess I'll call them. And we would like to do that as soon as possible, of course. And and the and the California Firefighter CU is very familiar with these kinds of processes where you have to change names and things like that as you a lot of nonprofits elect new officers every year, for example. They're very used to that and can help. In fact, they were very helpful in providing information about the things we needed to do to get set up as a nonprofit in the state of California. So very good organization. Once a new council is in place, obviously they can do what they want, but I think they need to update the official paperwork and bank access so that they're in control rather than somebody else. They need to establish and populate the working groups, uh, and and the working groups themselves will undoubtedly need to flesh out the policies and procedures. Uh, the old Ronin audits actually requested certain kinds of documentation in order to get grants, contracts, uh, that sort of thing. And so that list of policies and procedures that were called for, at the very least, need to get fleshed out if the new organization is to ever do that again. And the issue is that while we're talking about dues, um, unless we have a really large number of members, we're going to have to figure out how we get enough funding to eventually have professional staff. Now, that's not likely to happen anytime soon, but if you don't start working on it, it'll never happen. And last but not least, they need to keep the operations of the Institute going. Um, and I'm sure there's a lot of things I've forgotten, but those are at least the minimums. Now, I said that I had some existing resources. One is the bylaws folder. These have been available. This has been available and known for the last 8 months or so, but I just created a Bitly last night and got this little whatever you call those things for it. And if you notice, this is the structure of that folder. It also has a subfolder for the policies. There are some possible logos. That's another thing that needs to be created probably. There's a discussion of fundings. There's some archives for there. There are a lot of documents we came up with over this period, and they're all in the archives. And there's the survey and its summary, a bunch of notes um, about our meetings, etc. A link to the Reframing Ronin document that you all know about for the last 8 months or so, actually probably longer than that. And the current copy of the bylaws down here at the bottom. We also have this GitHub drive that Jort's been maintaining. It actually was started under the old Ronin Institute. And its main component that's useful for you all is a documentation folder. The intent here is to use this as sort of the official version Um, the reason is that GitHub keeps copies or track of versions of things, so you can always get back to old versions and see who did what when. This is something that I learned from the ESIP Federation, is that lawyers love it because they like actually knowing who did what when, and when did such and such change get made and what it looked like before. Um, so I'm suggesting that you keep that up and keep doing that. Sorry, Duerr, if you're online. Anyway, that's all I have to say. And if you've got any questions, let me know.
Thank you, Ruth. If you'd like to stop the recording, then we can begin Q&A.
Okay.